The Anglo-Portuguese Alliance and the Settlement of Australia by Curtis Stewart. The Anglo-Portuguese Alliance, established by the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, is regarded to be the oldest alliance still in force. For over 600 years, the alliance has been invoked in wars and conflicts, but it has also had an influence in peacetime. The ancient alliance played a significant role in the initial British settlement of Australia in 1788. The settlement of the colony of New South Wales was greatly facilitated by the close relationship with Portugal, especially in the first 20 years of settlement. British claim and settlement of Australia. The establishment of the British settlement in Australia was predicated on the claim of the eastern coast of the continent made by Captain James Cook. During his first voyage in the Pacific, Cook came ashore on 22nd of August 1770 and formally took possession of the whole eastern coast, with all the bays, harbours, rivers and islands situated upon it. In limiting the claim of possession to the eastern coast, Cook respected Portuguese claims to the western portion of Australia. When Captain Arthur Phillip arrived in 1788 to establish the colony with the first group of convicts, his commission was to claim the eastern part of Australia to the 135th parallel meridian, again in keeping with the claim of Portugal to the western half of the continent. The Portuguese claim to the western half of Australia was based on two treaties. By the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain and Portugal agreed to their respective spheres of influence in the Americas. It is well known that the treaty created a line to the west of Cape Verde Islands and gave Portugal a claim to Brazil. However, it did not create a line of demarcation in the Orient. The question whereby the division of the Eastern Hemisphere remained unresolved until the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529. By this agreement, the eastern border between Spanish and Portuguese zones was 297.5 leagues east of the Maluku Islands. This gave Portugal control of trade with the important Spice Islands and the Portuguese-occupied Timor to the southeast of Maluku to enforce their claim to this region. The Treaty of Zaragoza did not modify the line of demarcation established by the Tordesillas, so the two lines created divided the earth into unequal portions, not equal hemispheres, of 180 degrees each. Portugal's portion was roughly 191 degrees of the earth's circumference, whereas Spain's portion was only roughly 169 degrees. There was a plus 4 degree margin of uncertainty as the exact size of both portions due to the variation and opinion about the precise location of the Tordesillas line. A difficulty with both treaties is that it was not easy for the Spanish and Portuguese negotiators to determine the precise longitude of the Cape Verde Islands and the Malacca Islands. Both sides produced maps to support their respective claim based on different lines of longitude. The disputes raged for years. In the Western Hemisphere, a de facto line of demarcation of the 51st degree meridian in Brazil was eventually accepted. The corresponding line in the Eastern Hemisphere is the 129th meridian. It is curious to note that the border of Western Australia, a north-south line bisecting the continent, is derived ultimately from a treaty negotiated in the 16th century between Spain and Portugal. Another interpretation of the eastern border was the 135th meridian, which is what was claimed by Captain Phillip on arrival in New South Wales. The western limit of 135 degrees east was shown on a 1744 map by Emmanuel Bowen, the royal mapmaker to King George II. Adoption of the 135 degree east as a boundary would have minimized provocation to the Portuguese by 1825. However, Britain was powerful enough and found it convenient to adopt the original line of the Portuguese under the treaty, 129 degrees east. Captain Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet. The First Fleet, sent out for the purpose of settling Australia with convicts, departed England in May 1787 and arrived in New South Wales in January 1788. The commander of the fleet and first governor was Captain Arthur Phillip, who had important connections and contacts with Portugal that greatly facilitated the settlement of Australia. Arthur Phillip's advancement in the Navy had been slow. He enlisted as an ordinary seaman in 1755, and in 1762 he was promoted to lieutenant. By early 1770s he was still a lieutenant, but had been placed on half pay. However, in 1774, the Portuguese minister of the colonies and the Navy, Marcelino de Castro, was recruiting officers for the Portuguese Navy. Castro had previously served as Portuguese ambassador in London and had made acquaintance with the Rear Admiral Honourable Augustus John Harvey, afterwards the Earl of Bristol. The Royal Navy had a regulation which permitted officers to offer their services to foreign navies, and about half a dozen British officers were recruited by Castro. Phillip thus had the opportunity to join the Portuguese Navy as a captain, serving in Brazil in the Spanish-Portuguese War. This was a conflict fought between 1776 and 1777 over the border between Spanish and Portuguese South America, the region that is today Uruguay. While with the Portuguese Navy, Phillip commanded a frigate. Whoa, lost my spot. While with the Portuguese Navy, Phillip commanded a frigate, Nossa Senhora Pilar, and played a leading part in the capture of the Spanish ship San Agustin on the 19th of April 1777 off Santa Catarina. The San Agustus was commissioned into the Portuguese Navy as the Santo Agostinho, and command of her was given to Phillip. In 1778 he returned to duty with the Royal Navy. Phillip's 3.5 years of service with the Portuguese Navy in Brazil gave him a knowledge of navigating the southern hemisphere and the port of Rio de Janeiro, which was useful in the voyage to Australia. He had also acquired a knowledge of Portuguese language and, even more importantly, a network of contacts within the Brazilian and Portuguese officials. This served him well in his role as commander of the First Fleet. The First Fleet convoy of 2 warships, 6 convict transports, and 3 storeships departed England on the 13th of May, 1787. On the 15th of August, they arrived in Rio de Janeiro and stayed until the 13th of September. The Viceroy, de Luis Velasquez, knew Phillip, and the reception given to the British was exceptionally friendly and warm. When the Viceroy found that Phillip was now Governor Phillip of New South Wales, he directed that the viceregal honours be accorded to the governor. One of the British soldiers in the fleet, Walken Trench, a captain of Marines, wrote of the fleet's visit in 1787. Some part, indeed, of the numerous indulgences we experienced during our stay here must doubtless be attributed to the high respect which the Portuguese held Governor Phillip, for it was many years he was a captain with their navy and commanded a ship of war on this station, in consequence of which many privileges were extended to us, very unusual to be granted to strangers. The long rest stop in Brazil of nearly a month was undoubtedly important for the health and well-being of the convicts and crew members, and ultimately the success of the entire venture. David Collins, who served as judge advocate and the secretary of the new colony, wrote of the stay in Rio that, during their stay in this port of refreshment, the convicts were each served daily with a pound of rice and a pound and a half of fresh meat, together with suitable portion of vegetables. Great numbers of oranges were at different times distributed amongst them, and every possible care was taken to refresh them and put them in a state of health and condition to resist attacks of scurvy, should it make its appearance in the long passage over the ocean, which was yet between them and New South Wales. The Reverend Mr. Johnson also gave his full share of attention to their welfare, performing divine services on board of the transports every Sunday of their stay in port. Collins noted that the following plants and seeds were procured in Rio de Janeiro: coffee, both seed and plant; cocoa in the nut; cottonseed, banana plant; oranges and lemons; guava, tamarind, prickly pear, eugenia, and jalap. When the fleet departed from Rio on the 3rd of September, the Viceroy ordered a farewell of 21-gun salute to mark respect. When Phillip stopped in Rio de Janeiro after the conclusion of his governorship on his way to England on his return voyage in February 1793, he was once again honoured with an extraordinary attention. The Anglo-Portuguese alliance underpinned the success of the initial voyage, and the visit of Governor Phillip to Rio de Janeiro established a precedent which was invaluable to the success of the new colony of New South Wales. Shortly after his arrival in New South Wales, Governor Phillip proclaimed the territorial boundaries of the colony. The western boundary of his jurisdiction was set at the meridian of 135 degrees east of Greenwich, so that New South Wales was made to include the whole eastern half of Australia. In 1825, the western boundary of the colony was extended to 129 degrees east, today's border of the state of Western Australia. The importance of Rio de Janeiro to Australia. In this paper, the critical importance of Rio de Janeiro to British interests, with particular attention to Australia in her formative years of 1787 to 1805. Rudy Bosse of Tulane University provides an analysis of why Rio de Janeiro was created, was critical to the foundation of Australia. He consulted the records of the British ships sailing to Australia and found that prior to the first decade of the 19th century, perhaps as many as 70% of the ships bound from England to Australia stopped at Rio de Janeiro. He notes that with the settlement of Australia, Great Britain was able to expand its network of commerce and trade in the Atlantic, Indian and Pacific Oceans. Rio de Janeiro and Australia played a key role in this network of supply centres and ports located throughout the Southern Hemisphere. During most of those years, the Spanish South American ports were closed to British shipping, and because of the Napoleonic Wars, were often belligerent. Rio de Janeiro was an ideal way station between England and the new colony of New South Wales, because the city had an excellent harbour, the British had free access for ships requiring supplies or repairs, and the location was superb for sailing to Cape Town or direct to Port Jackson, close to Sydney. It was only under Captain Arthur Phillip, who had contacts in Rio de Janeiro, Philip Gidley King, who a lieutenant on the First Fleet and subsequently acting governor and then governor between 1800 and 1806, stayed in Rio de Janeiro between the 25th of May and the 13th of August, 1807. King was on excellent terms with the then Viceroy, the Count of Arcos, and had easy access to him. Thus both Governor Phillip and Governor King enjoyed excellent relations in Rio de Janeiro, and the friendships and contacts were very beneficial there up to ship's captains seeking supplies and assistance on the way to Australia. As mentioned above, the eastern portion of Australia continent fell within the Spanish sphere according to the Portuguese-Spanish treaties, but the Spanish did not occupy it or trade in the region, leaving it open for the British. However, once the British had established their new colony, the Spanish took notice. A Spanish expedition commanded by Alexandro Maspina arrived in Sydney Harbour in 1793, one of the first visits by foreign ships. Following the visit, the Spanish considered invading the new colony, but the plan was never carried out. Conclusion. The British settlement of Australia was underpinned by a legal claim that acknowledged Portuguese historical claims in the region, thus had some validity in the eyes of other European powers, even if the claim did not acknowledge the existing occupation of the continent by the Australian Aboriginals. The initial settlement in 1788 was greatly facilitated by the web of contacts between Great Britain and Portugal, built up over the course of a long alliance. The suggestion that the 1386 Treaty of Windsor could ultimately be connected to the British settlement of Australia 400 years later in 1788 appears to be far-fetched. It does at the suggestion that the 1529 Treaty of Zaragoza between Spain and Portugal and some of the current borders of the Australian states. But this brief history shows that these linkages within the Anglo-Portuguese alliance can be argued to have been important. If the Anglo-Portuguese alliance had not existed, the settlement of Australia would undoubtedly have been more difficult and could have evolved in a different direction. Chris Stewart is a retired